All right, you guys ready to learn about parenting? Some purposeful parenting. I extended this one more week. So this was originally going to be our last week in this series, but we're going to do one more week next week. We're going to just kind of tie it all together and put a bow on it next Sunday for purposeful parenting. But if you've been around for the last month, we are looking at really God's character and how it reflects in how we parent, how we have relationship with our families and each other, how it influences us. And we've been using the analogy of a picture within a picture frame. You know, that picture that was passed down to us from our parents, our grandparents, has influenced and reflects out into how we parent, how we have relationships and influences in our lives. And so we're assessing that picture and figuring out how should we change it in a way that reflects the character of God rather than maybe what reflects how we were raised, and being intentional with doing that, choosing to make these changes and taking these self-assessments about ourselves. Because changing the picture is not easy. It's difficult as we've explored, as we've wrestled both with our own experiences and things that we've gone through in our life. And today is no different. I think we're going to talk about one that it was probably earmarked in people's notes as far as when are we going to hit on this topic, and it's an important one, and it's a difficult one. Because today we're going to talk about the idea of discipline. The idea of discipline. And I want to ask you guys a few reflection questions before I really dive into what I want to say. So just think about these rhetorically and just ponder these as we talk about this. What emotions come to mind when you think of discipline in the context of parenting? What are those emotions or those feelings that bubble to the surface when you think about the topic of discipline in the context of parenting? And how does that discipline we receive from our fathers or mothers influence your understanding of who God is? How does that influence how you relate to God? Does this reflect in how you relate to others, especially our parents and our kids? So think about this. Is God a part of this expression, this emotional, this connection you have to the idea of discipline? And what comes to mind? Perhaps fear, perhaps respect. What are those things that might come to the surface? And what I really want to do today, and what I'm going to talk a lot about, especially as we introduce this, is the idea of discipline or punishment. Are we talking about discipline or punishment? As we reflect these questions, there's a chance that we are connecting discipline with punishments as synonymous. And I just don't think that's true. We kind of have convoluted discipline and punishment as one entity. And I'm here to kind of separate that in our minds and how we relate to God, both in parenting as well as in our lives. Because these are completely different concepts. So let's start there. Let's start with the fun one, punishment. Let's start with the easy one, punishment. So I looked up a lot of Hebrew words and what we use to translate into English the idea of punishment from the Old Testament in particular. And the main word that's used, the one that's used most often, is the Hebrew word avon. Avon. It means iniquity, guilt, or specifically punishment for iniquity. So something that has been done wrong, you would use the word avon. Avon. And I had a lot of fun this week because I've been exploring Paleo Hebrew. And if you know a party until you've been exploring Paleo Hebrew. Okay? You haven't truly lived. But it was a form of pictograph. So before they had the actual alphabet of Hebrew that we know today and is confusing for people, right? They used pictures in the early version of Hebrew. And I think there's some things we can learn from looking at these pictographs. In fact, the pictograph for Alvon is a rope, just similar to what I have now. It's a wrapped up, knotted rope for the idea of punishment or iniquity that the Hebrew author has in mind. It represents the entanglement of our wrongdoings and the punishment of shame that often accompanies the iniquity. In fact, it wraps us up, it ties us up into a certain kind of knot. It just entangles us in these things, which is kind of the biblical idea of what happens when we are living in iniquity. It just kind of ties us up. It causes us to fall over and trip. It causes us to be wrapped up. We have a hard time figuring out where we begin and the rope ends, is the way the Hebrew authors are thinking about the idea of Avon. And as the same accompanied with punishment is when punishment is tied to us, we're entangled in it, we're wrapped up in it. The shame and guilt of the punishment that we've received actually then can re-identify us as someone who was tied up in a rope, entangled, where we don't know where rope ends and where we actually begin. And if we're not careful, our wrongdoings will actually warp our identities and how we view ourselves. In fact, iniquity is often taught that if you partake in it so much, it actually will become who you are, that you start to identify by the iniquities that you have accomplished or the behaviors of which you choose to live. Now, there's a lot that God has to speak about the idea of iniquity, and most often it's taught in breaking through the rope. God's goodness is often revealed most in the ability to break through the entanglements of iniquity, break through the repercussions of the consequences of our actions in order to set us free from iniquity. That is the character of who our God is. But if we're not careful, if punishment is synonymous to discipline, especially as we think about parenting and with influences and relationships with others, it can lead to unintentional consequences, especially in how we view the connection between who we are and our behavior. And our kids are developing this the same as we do and are still, is that our connections and our behaviors are tied to how we are disciplined or in some ways alvon, wrapped up, entangled, and ensnared by our punishments. There was a psychologist named Stephanie Fu. She wrote a book called What My Bones Know, a memoir of healing from complex trauma. And she says this. She says, I was taught that punishment and shame were the logical and necessary reactions to screwing up. Anybody else been there? The benefit of punishment was that it would keep my wild and terrible natural tendencies in line. It would shame me into being better. When something went wrong, there had to be fault. There had to be blame. There had to be pain. Now I knew I was wrong. Punishment didn't make things better. It mucked things up even more. And she uses an example here of a father who wraps himself up in the punishment of his past. She says, a father's self-punishment did not grant him his daughter's forgiveness. It did not whip his sins out of him. Instead, it removed him from his family by isolating him in a prison of self-loathing. I think that in itself captures the idea of what punishment can do when it wraps us up and entangles us in who we are. In fact, it pushes us away. It pushes us in the opposite direction into loathing, self-hatred, lower self-esteem. And I really think this is one reason God wants to break through our iniquities, to free us from the ropes that we find ourselves snared in. Punishment often imprisons us, wraps us up in shame, and that shame will lead us to unresolved self-hatred, loathing, and this is not what the Bible calls discipline. This is alvon. It's completely different than what the Bible calls discipline. And how do we distinguish punishment? So here's a few distinguishments I thought were helpful. Punishment focuses on penalizing undesirable behavior, aims to deter negative behavior through negative consequences, can be inconsistent. This is definitely my experience. When I've tried to alvon my kids, I find myself radically inconsistent, right? When do you choose when to do this or not? It may not provide guidance for better behavior. It just shows that there's negative consequences for that behavior. It's often immediate and reactionary, as we talked about last week. That's in the idea of patience. We're not trying to be reactionary and immediate all the time. Obviously, when a kid's walking up to an outlet with a fork, react quickly, right? But in the sense of when we're disciplining our children, we don't want to react quickly and immediate, reactionary out of emotion. It addresses short-term behavior without teaching long-term skills, which I think is another key differentiator between punishment and discipline. It addresses short-term behavior without teaching long-term skills. While there's a place within parenting around giving space for our kids to learn that their decisions have consequences, which is a part of the concept of alvon, that we are there to allow them to kind of go through the consequences of their decisions. That's a part of you could say, is part of alvon. Punishment itself is not a good teacher. Punishment itself is not a good teacher according to these things. Where there is often Alvon, we see God's response as where I want to camp for a minute in our relationship with God, is when we make a mistake, by how those things have been taught to us and how we have been treated when we have made mistakes in our past. What do you expect God to do? I think for some of us, when we make a mistake, when we step into sin, when we fall into our own brokenness, whatever it might be, we're kind of expecting God to bring the hammer. How many of you are with me on that? Where you're like, God's going to take something from me. He's going to hit me harder than you're kind of sitting in this place of fear of what God is going to do to punish you. Let's look how he deals with the first murderer quickly and briefly in the Bible here. This is the story of Cain killing Abel in the 4th chapter of Genesis. So Cain has just done the deed. He has just killed Abel with a rock due to his jealousy. And here he is now hearing the consequences. In verse 10, it says, the Lord said, "What have you done?" to Cain. "Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Now, it's important to understand, especially in the first few chapters of Genesis, that these types of things that God is saying are descriptive, not prescriptive. He is giving the consequences of the action to the individual. He does the same thing to Adam and Eve, to his parents in Genesis 3. That because of these actions, here are the consequences, and this is what he does with Israel too. Descriptive rather than proscriptive. So Cain is understanding these consequences. This is what his response is. "My punishment, my avon, is more than I can bear. Today you were driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me." He says, "I'm going to be bringing the hammer down on me, aren't you? Where else am I going to do? I'm done. I'm done skiing." And this is a lot how we feel ourselves. Sorry, I just make up words. I don't know. I'm sorry. But we expect the hammer, don't we? We expect the hammer on us when we make these types of things. And Cain is reflecting on this. But this is what the Lord's response is. When we might think that God's bringing the hammer of Alvon or punishment into our lives, think about Cain here. In verse 15, he says, "But the Lord said to him, 'Not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over.' Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him." We often think of this mark. I remember watching these Old Testament drama things, from 1997, and Cain's response is, "Oh," he's morphed into this mark, but it's really is this idea. This is God preserving Cain. Cain's lineage goes off and does terrible things. They go build a city, and it's a terrible place to be. But yet God, in his grace, breaks through the avon of Cain, through his punishment, says, "Hey, there's a mark on you that says you must live." A mark is also, in again, Paleo-Hebrew, is a covenant or a promise. It's fun as Christians to think about this. If you are on my Facebook, you already know this, but the idea of tav, which is the mark or a covenant that God uses in Paleo-Hebrew, is actually a cross. Isn't that cool? Now, we're looking 3,000 plus years ago, 4,000 years ago, and the idea of God's mark or his sign or his promise is marked as tav, as a cross. God breaks through the avon, the punishment. He goes through and breaks through the rope, cutting the ropes, freeing us from the consequences of iniquity. Sometimes, we do have to bear these. Sometimes we have to reap what we sow, right? That's a common thing that a lot of us are very familiar with. But it doesn't become who we are. It doesn't become our identity. We don't get so enrolled into our iniquities that God can't free us. And punishment often encourages us to continue to be bound up in our shame and guilt rather than setting us free. While Cain's avon led him to shame and fear, God's grace was marked on him, giving him life, sparing him from death. So how do we think about this as parents? Well, we need to be careful to impose punishment with the intention of discipline. We have to somehow separate these things in our minds. think too often these two become synonymous, and they're not. They are very different when you look at how the Bible teaches these things. When we use punish in place of discipline, kids tend to respond to one of three ways. They respond out of fear, they fight back, or they flee. Especially in adolescence, the flee is one that you'll see quite often. They out of fear, they fight back, or they flee. This is how we arouse resentment in our children. This is exactly what Paul is speaking against in Ephesians. It is, Father, don't exasperate your children. Fathers, don't provoke your children. Don't discourage your kids. This is exactly what he's speaking against, this idea of bringing down hammers to the point where the kids are provoked, they're discouraged, they're exasperated, leading to disunity and division, and they're not learning anything other than how to respond to negative things. Rather than disciplining them, where they're too afraid to take risks, they're too afraid to make mistakes, and we need to have people who are it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to fall and be able to get back up again. I think we're too afraid of what happens if our kids stumble and fall because of the punishment they received for falling last time. So many of us are expecting a divine punishment for those mistakes we made. We're waiting for God to punish us because we often punish ourselves for our actions. I think a lot of us punish ourselves a lot more stricter and harder than even God does. Sometimes it's hard to even receive the forgiveness of God. I mean, people think it's so easy. God makes it so simple. Here's a gift to receive, and yet you're like, it's hard to receive a free gift. I mean, it's hard to receive something where he forgives your iniquities, that he frees you from the rope by grace. Yet God, as a father, would rather bring correction through his grace rather than leave you in shame and guilt and punishment for your mistakes. Rather than leaving you in shame or in prison for your iniquities, his desire is to set us free, and this is a component of discipline. Grace and power that has given us freedom of correction. So let's talk about discipline now. Discipline. Get this rope out of here. Get out of there, iniquity. No. So the idea of discipline is the Hebrew word musar. Musar. These are fun, right? Come on. Musar. So this means to discipline or to bring about correction. And I have another prop here, hidden behind the baptism. Maybe you know this. It's a rod or a staff. If I was going to use my rod for punishment, all right, someone come on up here. But no, the discipline or to bring about correction. And the pictograph for this is a really neat one. The pictograph for this is a staff, similar to what I have here, but not just any staff. It's a staff giving support. So those three beams there is a staff indicating a support staff, so someone kind of leaning in on it. And the next pictograph next to it is resh. This is the head. So in the idea of a Hebrew pictographic mind, of Paleo-Hebrew, you have a support staff of someone resting with a head of direction looking at it, which means that they are looking for guidance. A guidance in the support staff is what discipline is looking at in Hebrew. Turning the head of a child or a student in the direction of support rather than maybe what punishment or iniquity would be, which is pushing them away. You guys see in the differences behind the pictographed views of these. You have one that snares you and entangles you, keeps you wrapped up, and one that says, hey, lean in on it. I'm going to guide you. It's a very different type of view here. It symbolizes a guide guiding someone directly by simple correction. And you'll see shepherds do this. This is what pastoring in its essence is simple guidance. You'll see them as they walk their sheep. You'll view this as they walk along with their sheep and these simple rods and staffs that they do. And it's just these little guidance to make sure they're on direction. They're not smacking the sheep. Hey, get over there, They're just walking with them as they cross streets, as they go about. It's just a simple guide and a support to help get them to where they need to be. This is the idea of what discipline is. This is why the image of a staff or a rod is often used in connection with the term musar. Let's look at a few, shall we? Here are a few examples, especially when it comes to the Proverbs and the idea of wisdom and what it's like to be wise in this world. Proverbs 22:15 says, "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline will drive it far away." Now, a lot of us, we hear the rod of discipline and we think, oh yeah, you get them. But that's not what he's talking about. It's the rod of discipline. It's this simple guidance. Hey, I'm going to be involved and I'm going to guide you. You don't know where you're going yet because you're a child. I'm going to help you. I'm going to support you. Follow in the guidance. Guidance over punishment. Proverbs 13:24, "Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them." You're involved. Sparing the rod means you're like, I'm not, go ahead, go do whatever you want. Hope you survive, sheep. Right? That's not the idea of who God is. That's not a wise thing to do. We don't spare the rod. We use the rod. We use the support and the staff and the guidance and the wisdom to lead and direct our children. We love our children. In fact, one of the most famous stories that we have of not disciplining children is in the story of David and his son Ammon. When it says that David did not do anything when Ammon did terrible things to his daughter. Things that are well above the PG-13 pay grade. Yet he did nothing. He was angry, and that was it. And in the mind of the Proverbs, he didn't spare the rod. He didn't intervene. He wasn't among his children to be able to bring guidance. He did nothing in response to it. And it led to some terrible consequences for him and his family. Proverbs 29:15 says, "A rod and a reprimand," this is a reproof, a public showing of consequences of the actions. "A rod and a reprimand impart wisdom, but a child left undisciplined disgraces its mother." Again, the ideas of what it means to be wise always seem to connect something of a rod or a staff a part of disciplining. Not in the sense of punishment, which I think some of us probably think when we read those, but in the sense of what it looks like to guide, support, correct in a way that leads to fruitful change in years to come. In our cultural context, it's easy to associate rod more with punishment. I think I used to. Until I started studying this stuff. I absolutely did. But as we evaluate the history and usage of this word, a better way to understand it is shown. A supportive guide and correction. Is that how we now view our God? Do we view our God as someone who is there in a supportive guide and is there to bring correction as a loving shepherd walks with us? There's reasons why Jesus used the good shepherd imagery, right? Of someone who's guiding and correcting rather than waiting for us to mess up so he could knock us on the head, which I think some of us probably have that relationship with God. I'll put you down there now. There you go. So distinguishing discipline. This is how this is different than punishment. One, it focuses on teaching and guiding. So we see a focus more on teaching and on guiding. Aims to develop self-control, responsibility, and positive behavior. Involves setting clear expectations. So expectations, I think this is probably one of my favorite words as I develop, especially my emotional health and things like this, is making sure people understand what the expectations are. My dad, I don't know if this is right or not, but he used to say this all the time. He's like, remember who you are. Remember whose you are. Speaking of the Van Arsdale name, don't throw it through the mud, basically, right? Remember who you are and whose you are. There was expectations that I knew and understood how to behave and act. Not so that he could punish me if I didn't do them, but so that I would understand and know that this is how we behave. He gave, providing feedback. Again, this is something that I relish. I hope that you relish. Feedback is a fantastic tool to learn and to grow. It can also be one that is manipulated. So be sure you're careful with who you're giving your feedback to. But I think feedback is so beneficial. that we should all be open and receptive to learning new things, to getting feedback, to developing our skill sets. All of these things are a part of discipline. It's consistent and develops positive reinforcement. Again, consistency is key. You hear that a lot in Bible interpretation as we think about how to understand the Bible, but we also do it in how we behave, in our behaviors, that it's consistent. Or can we live in a disciplined life that's consistent? And how we live with our children and our families and our relationship with God, are we seeing consistency there? And this is one I think is one of the most important. Discipline tends to look at the long-term development of a child rather than short-term, small, little consequential changes in the moment. So it looks at the long-term development, how to walk and live in this world rather than, hey, you messed up, go sit in the corner. Discipline has different outcomes. It tells children what they've done wrong, right? It tells children what they've done wrong. It gives them ownership of the problem. Help them to walk through the problem. Gives them ways to solve it. How do we think about this issue and how do we solve it together? Keeps their dignity intact. It doesn't make them less human. Sometimes kids, because of their vulnerability and their size, and we sometimes will just say, we treat them differently because they're smaller, right? We don't see them necessarily as we would see a human. Keeps the dignity intact. Whereas punishment is doing something to a child, and I think this is significant, discipline is doing something with the child. So you're helping them to think about the consequences. You're helping them to think about the behavior. You're helping them to think about why or why not we don't do these things. And sometimes you're not going to know the answer, but you allow them to talk through it with you, walk with them through them, rather than just being the Avon to them. It's crucial that we entangle this synonymous nature of punishment and discipline in our minds. Our relationship with God will change, especially through hard times. And our ability to walk with our children just might change at the same time. When we think about God's discipline, and we're going to look at it in a second in a contextual of the New Testament, is that it will change how we view God, especially in difficult times. And then Psalm 23:4, one of the most famous Psalms of all time, I think gives a better description of what God does, and it inspired these famous words. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Again, the idea of a rod guiding and correcting instead of bringing down a hammer is exactly the image here of our God. In the hardest and darkest of times, we see a good God leading us. A rod as a punishment doesn't fit well with this statement, but a supportive guide, one who corrects us and intervenes, is involved in our lives, absolutely does. Let's look at a New Testament example of the difference here. One of the best ones you'll find is in the book of Hebrews. Now again, to understand what the author is saying here in Hebrews 12, it's important to understand the context of Hebrews. Hebrews is a sermon that was written to a group of people that is just hanging on by the edge of their faith. I mean, this is like we are getting ready to just run for the hills away from Jesus because of the difficulties that they're going through. Now in Hebrews 12, it tells us they haven't bled yet, they're not being martyred yet, which for me is the extreme. But these are things that probably we've all wrestled with, that they're wrestling with. They've lost family that's rejected them. They've lost social status because of their following Jesus. They've lost value. They've lost all these things that are that people get themselves entangled in the world. And they're like, I don't know if it's worth it anymore. We don't know if it's worth all the hate. We don't know if it's worth all the rejection, if it's worth being treated the way we're treated to follow Jesus anymore. And this is why the author is writing what they're writing. They were ready to give up. Maybe some of them were even in prison. Destitution was a thing. There was a lot of stuff there happening, I think, within this church that the Hebrew author is trying to write. And this is what they choose to say to encourage this group of people. The writer says, have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement? Okay, we don't often think discipline as a word of encouragement, do we? But here it is. The word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son. It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Don't make light of it. Don't reject it is a Greek word there. Don't reject the Lord's discipline. Don't reject his correction and guidance. Again, in the context of difficult times. And don't lose heart. Don't become discouraged when he brings correction to you. Rebuke is a kind of a fancy theological term. Again, we kind of think of this guy yelling and screaming at people, I rebuke you, right? Like that's kind of how we think about the word. It's really more of this it's a public correction saying, hey, okay, we're going to go through this together. This is how we're going to get through it. And he says, because the Lord disciplines what? The one he loves. And he chastens everyone he accepts as a son. He corrects, he redirects everyone who accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. Endure hardship as correction, as guidance. God is treating you as his children. This is the encouragement, that he loves you and that he is going to treat you as his children. There is a value there. There is a social upbringing there of saying, hey, you know what the world is treating you like, what the things of the world are telling you you are? I am going to treat you as a child, as my own child. He says, for what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate. He says, think of the things you're going through, the hardships you're going through. He says, change the perspective in your mind. Instead of saying, oh God, I can't believe all these things are happening to me. He says, this is the truth, is the fact that he's walking with you in it, and the fact that he's with you in it means that you are legitimate. Not true sons and daughters at all. The author writes this to encourage the people in the Hebrews setting in hard times, not bury them in shame. You know, he could have very well got up there and said, hey, all you guys who are doubting, get out. Get out of here, you doubters of doubt. I don't know if that makes sense. Get out of here, you doubters. You know, but no, he says, you know, like know who you are. Know the legitimacy of who you are, how God views you in the sense that he is going to walk with us through this hardship, and through that, at the end of it, we're actually going to create an endurance. We're going to learn more about him. We're going to know more of his character. We're going to know and be more solid in our faith through it. I don't know if we necessarily see discipline in our modern mindset this way, is that we are walking through a hard time with our kids, with people in relationship with, saying we are going to reveal more of who God is in that experience. And that's the power of a parent, is that especially when we proclaim Jesus as Lord and we are dealing out discipline, and if it's in the form of punishment, our kids are going to reflect, oh, this is who God is. That he is more of a punisher than he is a disciplinarian. And this is why it's important to have these untangled. That the idea of suffering for the sake of their faith teaches them an important identity, that they are legitimate children of God, that they will be built up rather than tore down. You know, in parenting or in life, we will endure difficult things where we will want to throw in the towel or find alternate means of hope and endurance. It happens all the time. But it's exactly through these things that discipline helps us. Like a rod and a staff, it gives us direction. Further on in that passage, it says, God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. This is Hebrews 12, 10 through 11. That we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time. No one likes being corrected. Who likes being corrected in here? Right? Nobody likes to be told, hey, just endure when you're in hard times. But it's painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness, of right standing, of goodness, and peace for those who have been trained by it. So we do things now as parents, as grandparents, as aunt and uncles, as we discipline the children in our family, as we walk alongside them, correcting and guiding them, we know that there is going to be a harvest of righteousness and peace, and they'll be trained by it when they're directed to who God is and how he treats us and guides us. Anything we do, we plant little seeds in the lives of our children. You know, and they're reflecting on this, and they're going to reflect who God is based on a lot of this, which is why we must be intentional and purposeful in how we go about doing this. God wasn't bringing down the rod of punishment to the Hebrews. He didn't use fear tactics. He just told them the truth. He says, endure. Learn about me as I guide you when it's painful, and in the end you will share in my holiness. You will reap a harvest. And again, I think this is the biggest point, is that discipline tends to build up rather than tear down. Discipline tends to build up rather than tear down. And I think this is the question we have to think about as we are around our children, our grandchildren, our nieces and nephews, or just even within community with one another as we think about this. Am I somebody who, when someone makes a mistake, or when they do something I don't like, or when I'm frustrated or discouraged, am I going to be someone who builds up or tears down? Am I someone who reflects the discipline of God, the correction of a shepherd? Or am I someone who is going to bring the staff as a weapon? And one pastor told me are you going to be one who lifts the sheep or beats the sheep? Right? I want to be a people who lift the sheep. I don't know about you. Through the hard times, through the different things, we have a perspective shift that says, boy, these things are going to teach us more about who God is. In the long term, we'll reap the benefits of it. As parents, there are a million voices out there telling us how to raise our kids. For those who have raised their kids, there are even more voices telling you how you did it wrong. I hope that this is not one of those. As we go about our walk with the Lord, we are not only teaching and correcting our kids, but through the process, we are learning more about who God is and how he can correct us. Teach us about who he is and how he reveals things. And no matter where you're at in this season of life, I want you to remember this, that you have a Father in heaven who is not there to punish you, to wrap you up further in your shame and your guilt of the consequences of sin. He is not there to beat you. He is there to set you free. He is there to give you grace when you need it. He is there to bring correction when you need it. He is there to guide you and direct you and point you to the things that he cares about and try to guard you from those things he doesn't want you exposed to. He is not there to punish you for your mistakes, but there is a God who wants to correct you, guide you with grace and mercy. That's who I want to follow. As someone who lovingly walks with me, knows my past, knows my brokenness, knows my sins, and is not waiting for me just to make one fail and just reject me. That he's there to correct me through it, to guide me, saying, hey, when he told me, when he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you, I take that to heart. I take that to heart, and it changes me about how his love is for me and how my love is for others, and I hope it does the same. Because his love is what we desire and what he wants to give out to us and wants to see us grow and not fall into a pit of despair.